Welcome back to Unlocking Nature. This has now become your platform, our platform, and it's a space where different voices come together to imagine the future of conservation in Africa. And my name is Robert Ganzamori. I'm from Rwanda, and I'm part of Share in Africa. I'm very, very happy and honored to be your co-host this evening. Now, with the business of tonight, we have an interesting topic. We will be asking ourselves an urgent and bold question. Climate change has broken conservation. What are you going to do about it?
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully this all works in the way that it should. Let's give it a go. So I'll just introduce myself very briefly. I'm mostly an environmental writer. I do a bit of environmental consulting and various other things. And I'm very, very interested in nature conservation. I've been working on this issue probably for over 20 years in various different ways, looking at various different aspects of nature conservation, how it gets paid for, the moral ideas that inform conservation. I'm very interested in the language that's used to talk about conservation. And I've lived in quite a few countries around the world, and I've looked at different ways that conservation gets done in different countries. And I've also done quite a lot of reading and work on climate change. And in late 2023, I released this book in the US. The cover you see in front of you, which really informs a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And just to say, a lot of what I talk about is a kind of a provocation. I don't always provide answers, but they're kind of challenges for folks to start thinking about certain issues which I think are not always thought about within the conservation world. And I would also just like to say the talk goes across a range of different subjects. It wanders around a little bit, but just stay with it. I think you'll get something out of it, and I'm more than happy to engage in discussion and debate, of course, at the end of it, if people do have questions. Anyhow, here's the book. It's called The End of Eden: Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown. And people often want to know, why did you write this book? And I wrote the book because a lot of what I see in the climate change media, let's put it this way, media about climate change is focused very much on humans. It's focused on our species, Homo sapiens, and it doesn't really look at what's happening to the millions of other wild species around us. And I thought it was time to rectify that. So I wrote a book that really looks at each chapter looks at climate change and how it affects nature. For example, I have a chapter dealing with diseases. I have a chapter dealing with extreme weather, possibly, and various other aspects of climate change. And within each chapter, I tell the story of individual species. I really try to make species almost like characters in the book, so that people who are not necessarily biologists, who don't understand biology, get something out of it. And really, as a way of telling these stories, as a way of people starting to understand, let's say, the science behind climate change, and how it affects and how it actually works, how climate change actually, the mechanics, let's say, of climate change. There's also an aspect to this book that is a little bit like ecology and evolution 101. So, there's a bit of that in there, an introduction to those types of topics. Anyway, I thought I'd start by telling a few stories from the book. And the first I'd like to tell is the story of the yellow-billed hornbill. Now, folks in this session who know birds know that this is quite a common bird in the savannas of southern Africa. It's loud, it's quite large, it's characterful. It's a very well-known bird. But I came across this incredible research that's been done in the Kalahari region that shows that the yellow-billed hornbill is disappearing from the core of the Kalahari very rapidly, in fact, due to increased daytime temperatures. And what struck me about this story, and which is true of a lot of things, is that climate change often works on species in a very quiet or subtle kind of way that's not always easy for, let's say, people who aren't paying a lot of attention to see, or for people who are not scientists to see. And, it's these birds are dying out, but not in this dramatic way. It's not like there are huge, overwhelming heat waves that are coming over the Kalahari and killing, thousands of birds at once. What is happening is that these birds, in a sense, are running out of time. Climate change is destroying their time budgets on every day. And how this works is, yellow-billed hornbills are very good at dealing with heat, very hot days, high temperatures. They manage to get through and live through very, very hot conditions by this very, I say, very, very sophisticated technique that's called sitting in the shade and doing nothing. So basically, when things get very, very hot, yellow-billed hornbills will find a shady bush, get underneath it. That gets them out of the direct radiant energy from the sun. They will also not move, so they're not producing thermal energy or heat within their own bodies by moving their muscles. And they'll pant because birds do not have sweat glands. So these birds are using the inside of their mouth to evaporate water off, to offload thermal energy to reduce their temperature. And they can get through very, very hot periods alive by doing this. The only problem is they can't do anything else while they're sitting in the shade and doing nothing. They cannot find enough food. They don't have enough time in the day to find enough food to keep their youngsters in the nest in good condition. So what's happening is, as temperatures are rising in recent years due to climate change, the hornbills of the Kalahari are spending more and more hours every day during their breeding season sitting in the shade and doing nothing. And as a result, their chicks in the nest are becoming malnourished. They're either dying in the nest or they're being born in such poor condition that they don't survive. And so in this very quiet kind of way, the hornbills of the Kalahari are rapidly disappearing. It's quite interesting, this research that's being done in the Kalahari, because it explains what's happening around the world. In the Mojave Desert, this is a photograph I took in 2019 in Southern California. Research has shown that the number of breeding bird species is down by about 50% since 100 years ago. In other words, in the last 100 years or so, half of the species of birds that used to breed in the Mojave Desert of Southern California no longer breed there. And this has long been a mystery. People haven't seen these birds, disappearing in this way, and it wasn't understood until the South African research was done. And it's quite interesting, again, to show how subtle this can be. When I went to the Mojave myself, I'm a very experienced bird watcher and a naturalist. I thought the place looked great. I walked around, I took wonderful photographs of these animals that you see here on and there were a lot of birds around. And it's only because in the early 1900s, a very famous ecologist called Grinnell started doing surveys of the birds and mammals of the Mojave Desert, that we know that these birds have disappeared because we have data from back then to compare to now. If you just went there now, you would have thought this is how the desert, always was, but it used to be a lot richer. I'll show you another example, a story I tell in the book. This is a typical landscape in Australia. It's covered with eucalyptus woodland. These trees, eucalyptus trees in general, are fire adapted, like a lot of Southern African, savanna species. They're built to handle fire. These species can survive burning typically, and they've survived. They've evolved around fire, and they've let's say evolved to tolerate and even thrive from fire over many millions of years. But now, with the unprecedented drying that we've seen in certain years in Australia, we've had these massive fires. I went there just after the enormous, what they call the Black Summer bushfires of late 2019 and early 2020. And I was completely stunned by what I saw. I'd never seen landscapes that were this thoroughly burned. The other thing that I hadn't thought about until I went there, and what I saw, was how much ash, after these fires that passed through these landscapes, how much ash had gone into the river systems. And you had just thousands, and probably in the end, if you total it up, many millions of tons of ash going into river systems and taking up all the oxygen and wiping out virtually every living thing in these rivers. And one doesn't normally think of fire as impacting aquatic ecosystems, but across huge areas of Australia, many rivers were pretty much sterilized by this vast volume of ash that killed just about everything in them. And it's really shocking to see these landscapes like this one here. This is in Kosciuszko National Park that I photographed this in, where I'm used to seeing burned landscapes having little patches of unburned vegetation in them, little places where the fire goes around and where small animals and so on can survive. But these fires in Australia were so unbelievably hot because of the unprecedented drying that I really couldn't see any refugia in these landscapes. And the fires had burned right through the soil and killed off all the seeds in the seed bank. And a large number of species have not regrown since these fires. And this is where it sort of comes to conservation. Here's another photograph I took in Southern California. Now, large tracts of the American West are also vegetated with, in this case, ponderosa pine, various types of trees that are evolved to handle fire. Again, in many cases, they rely on fire to reproduce and so on. Now, this landscape might not look like anything special, but it shows a very this landscape, when I saw it, had experienced a fire 14 years previously. Now, normally what should have happened is a fire comes in, it triggers these ponderosa pine seeds to germinate. And what I should be looking at here is a very strongly regrowing pine woodland. But as you can see in most of this, there are no regrowing trees at all. That's because the fire was so hot, it killed all the adult trees, it wiped out virtually all the seed bank, and now as little trees try to grow back, the few seeds that survived in this landscape, the little saplings are not living because the daytime temperatures and the soil surface temperatures are so high that it kills them. And so what you see here is how a single fire can flip an ecosystem into an alternate state. So here we have a sort of a pine woodland, almost a forest, not quite a dense forest, but a pine woodland that's been grassy scrubland. And if you're a conservationist and your job is to manage this landscape, this is in fact part of a conservation area, what I'm looking at, and it was established in order to conserve the ponderosa pine forest. Climate change presents this enormous challenge to you, because what do you do? Your job here as the manager of this landscape is to conserve this forest that this park was set up to conserve. Now, a fire comes along, and within a few hours, your forest is no longer a forest. Do you try and replant seeds of these trees that you find somewhere else? And with the understanding that because of the new climate, they will probably just get burned down and all over again, and you'll be back to where you are. Do you say to yourself, oh, well, this is now shrubland, and this is what I need to conserve? In other words, do you give up on the forest? Or do you maybe try and bring in other trees from elsewhere, kind of alien species or even genetically modified species of trees that might be able to handle the new fire and sort of recreate your forest, but with alien species? There's nothing within the normal moral framework of nature conservation that really gives you the answer to that question, because the moral framework of modern conservation, as it has been developed, say from the 1850s, it really started in the Western United States in the mid 1800s. You know, it's all about conserving landscapes as they were at some point in history, as they were before, with their full complement of native species, with all the native species that would naturally occur there. And it means getting rid of invasive species. It means bringing back in the species that were native there before. It means maintaining the appearance of the landscape as it used to be. The bottom line is, you can't do these things anymore. Climate change is changing, is transforming these ecosystems. In some places like this, very obviously and very rapidly. In other places, quite subtly. Here's another obvious example. These are trees that are now moving into the tundra of northern Alaska. So you've got these very open tundra ecosystems quite rapidly, in some cases, turning into forests. You've got another situation here. This is again in the Joshua Tree National Park in the Mojave Desert in California. This is a Joshua tree. The national park is named after Joshua trees. It's set up to conserve these Joshua tree forests, but climate change is now killing these trees in enormous numbers. You know, we stand a real chance within maybe as short as 50 to 80 years from now of there being no really healthy Joshua trees left in the entire Joshua Tree National Park. Here's another situation. These are before and after photos from Namibia. As we can see from the photographs in 1999, this was a very open sort of, let's say, grassy savanna. By 2019, 20 years later, it's turning into a kind of a thicket. A lot of this is the kind of woodification of the savannas that William Bond and Guy Midgley have done so much work on. I'm very glad to have them here tonight. But you know, as you can see, again, this is something that's happening at such a large scale now that no matter what you do in terms of management interventions, you cannot stop it effectively. And here's a graph I stole from Guy Midgley's presentation that I saw a while ago, but I think it's really a graph that everybody should see and should really sober you up if you've been drinking. This is a paper, Hernisch et al. From 2023 in Science, which tries to reconstruct the climate running back to 65 million years ago. And it looks at what the likely sort of temperatures were at that time compared to the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And essentially what we've done now, if this work is correct, what we've done by emitting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution is we've reset our atmosphere in that respect back, who knows, about 15 million years. We are, creating, certainly in CO2 terms, in carbon dioxide terms, a very, very ancient atmosphere when the world looked very, very, very different than it does now. Anyway, the bottom line is nature conservation is broken. Nature conservation is conceptually and practically broken in the sense that the traditional aims of nature conservation, as I outlined them earlier, are now impossible to achieve. And my very unscientific sort of anecdotal feeling is that although the majority of conservationists, by which I mean national parks managers, people who are working in different aspects of conservation, are actually, trying to save species from extinction and managing natural areas, are in denial about it, in the sense that the vast majority of them will say they accept the science of climate change, they accept that human-caused climate change is happening and it's real, but they haven't changed their approach to managing the areas that or the species they're still that they're responsible from. They're still doing things the old way. And I'd like to segue a little bit, do a little bit of a turn in this in this presentation, and just come back very close to home to my area. This is, of course, South Africa. I'd like you to focus on Cape Town in the bottom left. This is the area of Cape Town, the city, essentially the metro area. It's unbelievably biodiverse. The metro area of Cape Town has about 3,000 plant species in it, which is more than many countries do, certainly in Europe, very many more. And it has about 190 of those species are endemic to the city, are not found anywhere else except in the city. And a lot of them are threatened with extinction. And I'd like you to come even closer to my little part of Cape Town here. It's a town called Kommetjie. I've been using the app iNaturalist, which I'm a huge user of and believer in, along with some other folks in this town. We've been mapping and identifying plants in this area. This is a circle with a 3-kilometer radius. And as you can see, we've now documented over 1,000 species of plants within the circle. I mean, 2/5 of which probably is ocean, so it doesn't even count. This is absolutely extraordinary diversity in global terms. And again, many of these species are threatened with extinction. In fact, we've recently had a very local endemic species, a very beautiful plant, is probably now extinct in the wild. It's called the golden gladiolus. It was last known from a small patch near Ocean View, which unfortunately disappeared under informal housing during the COVID pandemic. For those of you who don't know the Southwestern Cape, this is a picture of typical, what we would call fynbos vegetation, this extraordinarily diverse, typical vegetation of this area. I'll just show you some photos that I've taken over the years of some of the incredible plants and animals that we have here. Again, very, very special, very, very diverse place. Here are some of the local bulb plants that I have growing in the veld near my house. But I'd like to point again, segue to another thing about how climate change is messing with conservation, is causing problems for conservation. Here's a vegetation map that was done of the Cape Town area. Now, this took an enormous amount of work. People basically went and defined different types of habitat, especially different types of felt that are characterized, among other things, by their soil type and by the typical or sort of indicative species of these types. As you can see, there's many, many different types of habitat or felt listed in that legend on the right-hand side. Now, again, this took a lot of work, and folks have gone and defined all of these things, and now these habitat types really have been written into law. In other words, if a certain type of habitat type, let's say this big purple thing in front of it, what's that? Oh, jeepers, I can't even see which one it is. But let's say if a certain habitat type has lost a lot of its area to agriculture or to housing and so on, and there's very little of this habitat type left, it can be classified as an endangered or a threatened habitat type. And this gives it, theoretically at least, some kind of legal protection. In other words, these habitat types are sort of built into law, and they're built into conservation policy, and managers use them and refer to them all the time. But now, again, with climate change is rapidly changing habitats all around the world. In other words, what we might call Atlantis sand fynbos, which is the first type of habitat on here, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, it won't look anything like the Atlantis sand fynbos of today. It will have lost some species. It may have gained some species. It might have changed in terms of its rainfall. And the legal definition of Atlantis sand fynbos, or the formal definition of that, will no longer apply. And again, the legal and the planning and the conservation implications of that are profound, yet very few people consider them. So another problem that we have around here, it's not particularly climate related, but it's definitely conservation related, is what I call pseudigenous horticulture. It's become very fashionable among certain people, and on the face of it, it's a very good thing to plant indigenous, native fynbos plants in your garden. And in theory, this could be a wonderful way of creating more habitat, more area for our endangered fynbos species. However, the horticultural industry, especially the native horticultural industry, is not particularly interested in that. It seems they want to make money. So when you go to a nursery and you want to buy, for example, a protea plant for your garden, you are usually unable to buy the wild protea species from your area of Cape Town that would be naturally nearby. You get sold cultivars and hybrids, these kind of artificial, if you like, types of proteas. This is, in fact, the nursery at the National Botanic Gardens. In fact, it's not even just a regular nursery. And what happens is people take these protea cultivars and hybrids, they plant them in their gardens, and the sunbirds and what have you, the pollinators, take the pollen from these cultivars in people's gardens and from parks and so on into the wild areas, and they create these hybrids, these what we call frankenflora. So we're now losing species in our wild areas due to hybrid integration from people planting indigenous gardens, in other words, trying to do the right thing, because the horticultural industry is not set up to do the right thing. And it's a very poorly studied topic. Even though we know of more than 30 different types of these hybrids, I could only find one real study on them. Another thing is, for example, here's a local species called Osteospermum moniliferum. It's the beetle bush. It's a very common, well-known sort of coastal bush. You know, a lot of the native gardeners use this. It's sold in a lot of the nurseries. Its distribution, you can see here from iNaturalist, is pretty much around the coast of southern Africa. But the problem is there are different forms, there are different subspecies. On the east coast of South Africa, we have a beetle bush that grows a lot larger than the native one. This is the native form, which is a much smaller plant that we get around here. But landscapers are bringing in this plant, which again, technically, if you read the label, it's the same species as what occurs locally, but it's a different form. And my fear is, and I'm already seeing this, here's some beetle bush that I photographed myself in Southeast Australia, where it is a terrible invasive species, takes over masses and masses of coastal areas and forms this absolute thicket. I'm already starting to see the eastern South African form of beetle bush, when it's planted here in the Western Cape, starting to behave a little bit too much like this for my preference. Anyway, so just like to flag this, notion of native alien species, which I don't think really gets enough attention. And it's actually going to become a much bigger deal as climate change becomes more entrenched. Also, just this idea of planting the wrong things and in the wrong places. In the United States, as an example, people have been encouraged to plant what they call milkweed plants in order to help these famous monarch butterflies, which go on long migrations and that have lost a lot of habitat. But again, people plant hybrids and they plant them out of their native range. They plant milkweed types that have very much bigger and richer flowers than the wild forms do. And what has actually happened is that the butterflies are now spending more time on these plants than they would on the wild form of these plants. And because the butterflies are spending more time on it crammed together, they're passing diseases to each other in a way that they never did before. And the butterfly population is actually now crashing because of people trying to help the butterflies by planting these plants, because they haven't been careful about planting exactly the right type of milkweed plants. Anyway, so what do we do about the problems of climate change, of people planting the wrong things in the wrong places? What do we do about thinking about managing areas? Now, the National Park Service in the United States, sadly, a lot of these people are now threatened by the Trump administration's cuts. There's some interesting people there who I've been in communication with who created what they call a resist, accept, direct framework, the RAD framework, and you can read more about this in your own time. But basically, it's a framework that forces natural area managers to accept climate change because it forces them to try and decide what they're going to do about it. Are they going to try and resist climate change in their area or the effects of climate change? They can't resist climate change, but if there's a wetland that's drying up, are they going to try and pump more water into it? Are they going to accept climate change, just sort of accept what it's doing to their landscape? Or are they going to try and direct it, try and push the change that they're seeing in a certain direction? Now, the weakness of the RAD framework is it doesn't really tell you what to do. It doesn't have a sort of hierarchy of aims or coherence of aims, but at least it forces natural area managers to deal with the reality of climate change. Here I'm going to segue again and just try and point out that a lot of work gets put into trying to predict what climate change is going to do to different ecosystems. And I've found a rather remarkably large number of papers that actually show that when people actually go and look at what's happening on the ground, a lot of species are not responding to climate change in the way that we might expect them to. This is a very interesting paper. You could read at some point if you feel like it. But basically, a lot of the methods that are used to try and predict what species are going to do in response to climate change don't always hold up. Here's another really interesting paper, which is, in Europe, as we expect things warming up, we would expect plants to move away from the equator towards the poles, plants moving to try and keep up with, let's say, cooler conditions or the conditions that they evolved in. They would move away from the equator to do that. But this very large study of a whole lot of vegetation plots basically found that a lot of plants are in fact not moving north, they're moving west, and they're actually moving towards factories that give off nitrogen pollution, that are enriching the soil with nitrogen. So the factories are actually a much stronger driver of plant range shifts than climate change is. Anyway, the other thing I'd like to just pop into this conversation is this idea of conflict between conservationists, because there's not a clear hierarchy of people don't really know what conservation is anymore in this era of climate change. And so we get people who say they want to, they're conserving nature, conserving the planet by getting us off fossil fuels and rolling out renewable energy, but then they're actually destroying natural habitats in order to create these massive solar farms, for example, in the United States. So there's a growing conflict between conservationists that didn't really exist in the same way before. And what I'd like to also say is, especially when I look at Africa, I believe that there are just immense shortages of conservationists, despite efforts like this to train people in conservation. I feel like we need, this is just a thumbs up, but I quite believe we need about 100 times more conservationists that we have now. And we don't have them, and we won't have them for a very long time. And people always say this is due to funding shortages. But I say that even if somebody came and dropped $1 trillion on you tomorrow, you wouldn't be able to use that money because you can't train up enough conservationists in time. So we need to be thinking about building communities of care, what I call communities of care for species, run by amateurs. And here's an example of one. These are people who breed rare fish in their basements, amateurs who save fish from extinction, maybe not in the wild, but there are these highly successful amateur networks of people doing that. Um, I also think as we go into the age of climate change, um, conservation should be much more open to careful experimentation. I think most conservation organizations, the big ones that we know about, are very, very conservative. They're becoming very, very risk averse, and they're not very good at experimentation anymore because, as we all know, experiments might fail. And I think a lot of large groups are terrified of failing and what that might do to their image. And I think we also need to learn to pay attention locally. So even, a lot of the attention goes towards, in conservation goes towards things like elephants and rhinos and what have you, all the big species out in the wild. But if you pay attention to what's happening in your immediate environment, even if you live in a city, you'll start seeing changes. And one that I've noticed in the last couple of years is that in my garden, I'm a big bird watcher. The species on the left is a speckled mouse bird. They've pretty much disappeared from my area. I see them now maybe once a year, once every 6 months in my area. Until about 3 years ago, I used to see them every single day in my garden. The species on the right is the red-faced mouse bird. I see that now virtually every single day in my garden. And say more than about 3 years ago, I used to see them 2 or 3 times a year. So some shift has happened in the environment where one species of mouse bird has been replaced by another. And I think as we pay attention to these things, we start seeing the effects of environmental climate and environmental change in our landscapes. And I just want to end this off. I've started using this as the last slide in a lot of presentations I do. Some years ago, I was in Texas in a small town, and at the edge of a very big marsh, it was a very, very weird place where everything seemed to be, it was so humid, everything was covered in moss and fungus, and it seemed like half the people in the town had spent half their lives in jail for murder. It was a very creepy place where you might want to, make a horror movie. And I saw this turtle crossing the road, and I snapped this picture, and I found this picture not too long ago again in my archive. And I thought, gee, we're all that turtle, because the name of this town, this is a real place, is Uncertain. This is Uncertain, Texas. And we're actually all this turtle. We're all just trying to cross the road. We're wandering into uncertain Texas, because one thing that climate change or climate breakdown does is it makes the world increasingly uncertain. So as conservationists, I think we need to be very aware of this, that we can do a lot of plans, we can do a lot of science, we can try and predict what's happening, but intrinsically, this is climate change brings on greater and greater uncertainty. And we need to work with that and around that. So with that, I'd like to end my talk, and I think we still have a few minutes for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Adam, for this bird's eye view of conservation. Also taking us back to the view of the turtle, wandering into uncertainty.
Yes.
I would like to welcome all the students here tonight. Everybody, we're all students, but a special welcome always to the students. They are our special guests. But I would also like to acknowledge about 4 years ago when we started the Share Screen Africa program, Professor William Bond was the very first speaker that we welcomed to our platform, and he's here tonight. So Professor Bond, you started something. We are now about 400 lectures later, so you started it. Thank you for that. We really appreciate that. And then also acknowledging Prof. Mike Bruton, who is in the audience tonight. And Prof. Mike Bruton has spoken about his garden. I'm not sure if he wrote about it or whether he spoke about it on this platform actually, and the habitat he created in his garden in Cape Town and everything that he attracted there. And I was wondering if he can maybe share some thoughts about that, because that's a bit of maverick conservation right there in the city of Cape Town. And I'm going to ask
see his microphone is off.
I just want to ask him to unmute, please. There we go.
All right.
I'm going to ask Maret to work with you in the background, and then we try again later. But in the meantime, we would love to open the floor to questions and comments. I also know that Prof. Guy Meadgley is here from the Stellenbosch University of School of Climate Change. And any comments that he would maybe like to add, you're most welcome.
Yeah, Adam, thanks. As always, very thought-provoking and quite unsettling in many ways, because one doesn't want to have the feeling that one of the primary means of conservation, which are fixed protected areas, are under severe risk. And I think that we need to take care not to feel that all this legacy investment in protected areas has been wasted. So I think it's very important that we don't sort of abandon all the good work that's been done up to now. But clearly we need as a conservation community to do some very, very careful thinking about two things. One is, how much is climate going to change before it starts to relax back? Because it has to relax back eventually. That's how the planet will function. So CO2 will ultimately peak and start declining because of the strength of the sinks in the ocean and on the land, which means the temperature will peak and then start to cool again. How much will the deviation be, and how long will that period of excursion be? Those two questions, I think, are going to drive conservation strategies for the next 50 years at least. But the adaptation and conservation world have not woken up to this reality. And once we can wake up to this reality, we can then start to figure out what is going to work and what has got zero chance of working, because we may need to abandon certain highly vulnerable fauna and flora, which could only be saved through ex situ conservation, possibly. I'm not saying that that's a given, but that's very expensive conservation and may not work. But so yeah, that's that's my initial response. We need some new thinking, and the conservation world is stuck in an old form of thinking. And it's very uncomfortable for all of us, I think. But thanks for that.
Could I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Well, Guy, as you know, and I've had a conversation with Guy about things I don't really want to talk about publicly at this point, because they're ideas that I'm still putting into a format. You know, I'm actually working on another book and at the moment, which is trying to really reconceptualize nature conservation for the age of climate change, to create a new or a clarified, let's put it this way, set of aims for conservation that is achievable, but also maintains value of what's been done in the past. I don't want to go into that. I'd rather that, you know, folks read the book or read the PhD or whatever comes out of that, you know, when they see it. But I do want to say that, you know, part of why I'm doing what I'm doing in terms of reconceptualizing is, again, this shortage of people that I mentioned. You know, it's like, again, people always talk about it as a money shortage. It's not a money shortage. We need to find a way for amateurs to actually do conservation, for people who are not professional conservationists to actually save species themselves, not just donate money to conservation organizations and so on. And again, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I've actually just received promise of a small amount of funding, a very small amount of funding from a foreign donor, to start a little project right where I live now, to start teaching ordinary people how to grow endangered species of plants in their yards, so that you know, we've been losing a lot of habitat in our area to property developments and so on, so that we can actually keep populations of these very rare plants growing in our gardens. And this whole idea freaks the living daylights out of most conservationists, professional conservationists. They do not want amateurs messing around with endangered species. And there's various reasons for that. They're scared that the amateurs are going to mess it up, but there's also a measure of gatekeeping, of like, I'm the expert, you know, of ego-driven or financial sort of war-driven. We've got to create a global movement of amateurs who actually conserve species themselves in their own spaces, their own communities. And that's the conceptual basis and the practical basis for that is what I'm working on right now. And so when you talk about ex situ conservation being really expensive, well, potentially it isn't. If, you know, one network of amateurs involved and things like this. Also, we need to think very hard about moving species, because, you know, you talk about protected areas. Conservationists often talk about we need to have corridors that species can move along as the climate changes. Well, as we know, a lot of our plants, for example, even our frogs, our reptiles, they will not be able to move fast enough to keep up with these changes, even if we give them the corridors. In other words, we are going to have to move them ourselves in some way if they're going to survive and not go extinct. We need to start working a lot harder on thinking around how we move things, orders of priorities, assessing impacts of moving things, because this has always been a no-no in conservation, right? That's creating an alien species by moving something into a place where, you know, where it didn't occur before. But we're effectively going to have to create vast numbers of alien species if we think about alien species in the very simple, old-fashioned sort of term. And how we do that and how we think about that, I think, is something that a lot of people have not sufficiently addressed.
I would love to know if there are any representatives of conservation organizations in the audience tonight. And if you have thought about it, please share your thoughts. It'd be interesting to know what the lecturers, Dr. Cheryl Ogilvie, may I put you on the spot? You are lecturing the future generation of conservationists. What do you think about these ideas? Because they are quite radical, and it's a question. It's a choice that we will have to make. Do we want to step in that direction or not? I see Claudia Roth has just commented curtly Tonkin is also there. I'm going to read Kirtley's question. It seems we still need more research into observed impacts of climate change on species, along with experimental studies to calibrate predictions and projection of climate species responses. But certain responses, climate change impacts on species might take very long to actually manifest, and we don't have enough long-term monitoring initiatives focused on monitoring climate change. So I was wondering, do we just wait until these impacts manifest? How can we be more proactive in advancing climate species response research and developing more accurate predictions? That's a tough one. Do we even have the time to do it?
Can I just throw a short response into that?
Yes.
Again, we're moving into an era which is more and more uncertain. You can do all the studies you like, you can try and predict, but I can guarantee you ecosystems are super complicated. They're not going to respond. Maybe sometimes they will, but a lot of times they won't respond in the way that your prediction expected them to. Whoops, sorry, I've just lost power in my house here. And so, sorry, I'm sitting here in the dark. Can you see me?
We can hear you, that's important.
Let me find, yeah, still my laptop is on a battery. Hang on one second. I have a cell phone here with a lamp on, so now you can see me. What I was going to say is, you know, I think it's much more valuable to explore techniques where you have, explore ideas where you have multiply redundant systems or approaches to saving species or managing ecosystems that have multiple points of failure. So that when the predictions don't go the way that you think they're going to go, you have a fallback position. And it's much more important to experiment and to be open-minded than it is to try, you know, I see this a lot with academics and I see this a lot with professional conservationists. They get stuck in analysis paralysis. They think that if they research the hell out of this and spend years and huge amounts of money figuring out exactly how this works, or exactly what's going to happen, then they'll be able to get a handle on it. And so they spend endless years researching and plotting the perfect conservation plan for this and that. Meanwhile, and exactly that has happened. Just a couple of, you know, we have this beautiful plant, this golden gladiolus. There was one last site for it. And people have sitting around wondering about how they're going to conserve this plant. It's been debated for like 20 years. And then during COVID, with everything that happened, people losing their jobs, an informal settlement arose. People just moved in there and obliterated, and there's now informal houses on top of the last habitat of this plant, and it is now extinct in the wild. And there's still no proper conservation plan for this plant. You know, whereas if they, years ago, they just started growing them in people's yards and giving the seeds to us amateurs to grow in our yards. There's also a lot of gatekeeping around that plant where, you know, you're not allowed to have this because it's an endangered species. We wouldn't be in this situation. We might have a large enough number of these plants that we could experimentally plant them in a range of habitats around this area and see if they survive. But because we got into doing it perfectly and only letting the experts do it, we're now in this kind of rather unfortunate situation. We only have a very small number of plants in captivity that are still largely being gate-kept and kept away from amateurs. They're not doing a proper conservation program for them, as I understand, because they don't have funding. They're waiting for the funding, which is probably never going to come. You know, it's like oftentimes with conservation, we know actually what we need to do to save species. We know what we need to do. There's very practical things that we could do immediately. We get stuck in this mode of crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's and making the donors happy and following all the regulations and I can't tell you how many times that has resulted in species getting into much worse situations than they were before. You know, so here we go. I don't make myself popular by saying this, but
certainly, I can imagine.
Yeah.
We've been able to get Prof. Mike on the screen, so welcome. And I would like to, you know, there's a typical example of a bit of maverick conservation, but by a high-level professional. So, Prof. Mike, tell us about your garden, please, and any other comments you want to add to the question.
Thanks, Johan. And firstly, if I could say I'm a great fan of the approach that Adam's taking. I think he provides an extremely valuable service as a link between scientists, conservationists, and the general public. And I really support his shock tactics, you know, talking about conservation being broken. I agree with you that it's not climate change, but climate breakdown. And you know, we really need to have more so-called environmental investigative journalists like him. We have no institutional baggage. They don't risk their careers and their research grants by speaking out against, you know, conventional thinking. They're free thinkers and courageous as a result of that. So it's extremely valuable what he's doing. I also support his sort of local is lekker approach. And just to mention my garden, you know, I've turned it into a sort of biodiversity stepping stone. I saw a drone image of it recently from above, and there's a little sort of emerald gem in the middle of a semi-desert sort of suburban environment. And I have people in my neighborhood coming to see my garden, to see insects, to see dragonflies, and to see birds that they haven't seen for years, if ever, in Cape Town. And to my amazement, my little pool, which is now completely converted into a natural wetland, acts as a stepping stone for, you know, yellow-billed duck, for instance, come in and spend a few hours and then they go on. I've had kingfishers come in. I've had banded weavers making nests overhead every single summer. But the question I would like to ask of Adam, I've been giving talks recently on insects and the drastic decline of insect populations worldwide, which I think is one of the most serious conservation problems. You know, we're all very concerned about the charismatic mega herbivores, and hundreds of billions are spent on elephants and rhino, but you know, the insects, which are the most diverse group of animals on the planet, let alone on land, are in a desperate state. A recent long-term study in Germany for about 110 years showed a 46% decline in insect populations in controlled, protected areas. And elsewhere in the world, you know, insect declines of over 75% are being recorded. And I was wondering if Adam has any views on this, because I think it's a serious problem that's not being given enough attention. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, we could talk for hours on this, and you know, I'm not sure how much time we have, but I second this concern around insects. I mean, I feel like I can see it in my own life. There are far fewer insects around the lights on my porch at night than there were, you know, just feels like 10 years ago, you know. And
or smashing into the windscreen of your car.
Exactly. I mean, I remember as a youngster driving across the Karoo with my dad, and we used to have to stop every 100 k's or so to clear the stuff off our windscreens. You know, stopping in Three Sisters and Hanover and all these places in the Karoo. And now I can drive straight across the Karoo, and I don't stop once. But I was a couple of years ago, I was actually in the Kalahari area at a remote farmhouse, and they had a light outside, and there were huge numbers of insects around the light. And I remember being quite shocked by that and thinking, my God, I mean, that's how all the lights were, you know, when I was a kid. But I hadn't seen that in so many years. It was stunning. And in fact, you know, again...
Sorry, if I could just say, I spoke recently to a forensic entomologist who used insects at crime sites to provide clues as to, you know, when the crime committed and so on.
Yes.
And it's a disappearing profession because they no longer have insect clues. The insects that used to get stuck in the radiators of cars, which would then be able to tell them when that car was last functional, at day or at night, They simply don't have that evidence anymore. And of course,
Wow.
when we think of the pollination services and many other services that insects provide, recycling nutrients, aerating soils, etc., we really are on a path to disaster by not looking after insects.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that I must add is I recently saw a paper on bird declines in otherwise apparently pristine Amazon basin rainforest. And a lot of that now is actually being tied. There was a very recent paper just came out a couple of days ago, I think, looking at how the idea being that as the rainforest is drying out, you're getting longer dry spells. You're actually getting huge numbers of insects not being able to complete their life cycles. And so insect numbers are crashing even in these sort of, let's say, pristine natural areas far away from pesticides and all these other things. And that in turn is causing a collapse in the insectivorous bird population, which is very, very dramatic in these areas as well. And again, we can talk about this for hours, but I always urge people, oftentimes there are climate components to these extinctions which are not maybe immediately obvious, when you look at them in the first place. But again, I'm actually a huge believer in ex situ conservation. That's another controversial view, I think, to a lot of conservationists still.
On CNN this morning, on the main news at 7:30, I think it was, there was a program about Ben Shelton from South Africa and his efforts to save the sandfish.
Yes, Jeremy, yeah.
Very much
he's just down the road here.
Private project outside of the normal nature conservancies and universities, etc. So I agree. And all the redfins and other indigenous fishes up our west coast that are threatened with extinction, they could be kept alive by amateur aquarists.
We still see this enormous reluctance in the conservation world to embrace ex situ conservation. But I can tell you time and time and time again where it's worked, where it's saved species have been able to go back into systems and they've restored ecosystems, and those species have helped to bring those ecosystems back. So again, I'll leave it at that. But there are just, I mean, we're going over time now. Johan, I think I don't want to be too rude here or whatever. People are still on the call, but there's so much that can be done if you don't, overthink it, if you adopt an attitude of a bit of humility, if you experiment, if you're open to failure, if you're able to set up what you do in a way that you can reverse it if it turns out to be the wrong thing, all of these things, there's just so much that can actually be done, and that's why, even though the situation overall with climate breakdown, with all sorts of things is dire, it's really, really bad. I mean, I tell people, and I'm not even joking, that the only reason I haven't done myself in is cheap antidepressant drugs. Anyway, let's unless there are more questions. Do you want to wrap it up, or what? How do you want to handle this, Johan?
I'd like to ask maybe you and Mike both, because you're both in the let's call it the business of micro and maverick conservation, and you mentioned that you received funding for a project. If you look at the potential, and also trying to think like, how can projects like this go wrong? So I think you've mentioned examples. People out of very good intentions go to a nursery and they buy a species that says fynbos, plant it in the garden, the wrong species, wrong place. Yes. How can we rather create then a framework where we can assist micro conservationists, let's call them that?
Well, this is exactly what I'm working on. What my idea is what I call light touch conservation organizations. In other words, they're not doing the work themselves necessarily of saving the species, but they provide information, to communities, to people. They provide actual species to people, because that's often very hard to get, right? The actual plants or the fish or the whatever it is that you want to conserve, in the right ones from the right local genotypes, from, you know, so that you're not creating these hybrid messes or you know, a bad invasive species, and inspire people and create community. In other words, an organization that facilitates a movement or amateurs to get involved, rather than doing the work and gatekeeping it. That rather that is there to share things rather than hoard information, if you know what I'm saying. And that's exactly what I'm working around. I've called the beginnings of this little thing here, it's a boring name in the sense that there are other groups that are friends of, but I've called mine Friends of Kommetjie Fynbos, which, if you will know, in Afrikaans has the acronym FOKOF, so that people remember it. so you know, I work in the media, I work as a journalist. A lot of this is about communication. It's about finding, you know, the right ways to frame things, the right ways to package information that people can actually use it, you know. And I'm a huge fan of iNaturalist, this app, you know, where you go around, because quite frankly, I'm a bird person. I was a sort of a fish keeper as a teenager, and I was into reptiles and snakes, and then I got into birds. I studied birds. The fynbos, I grew up in Pretoria. I'm a bushveld boy. But when I came to the Cape, the fynbos terrified me. There were just too many species. I didn't know how to even start learning to identify these plants. So for like 15 years, I just didn't, until I discovered iNaturalist, which it's an imperfect tool, but it helps you to at least start learning the plants in your area. And then you can start communicating with other people, like experts online, to identify these things. And now I safely say I can probably identify a good 300 species in my area, and probably another 200 down to genus level, at least, just within maybe 2 or 3 years of in my spare time doing this stuff. So, you know, we need to find ways that basically make it very, very easy for people, amateurs, to conserve species. Find the species that are really, really easy, and then create this moral framework and this conceptual framework that they can understand and get behind. You know, to create a movement has to have ideals. It has to have goals. It has to have beliefs. You know, a lot of this is about morality and how we talk about morals, you know, and so scientists are often very uncomfortable with that as well. And again, I'm working on that right now. I'm working on this project. It's called A Future for Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown, because that's what I want to see. I want to see nature have a future within this very difficult, increasingly uncertain, chaotic, if you like, era that we...
Mike, I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Johan, I'd like to take a slightly different angle and, you know, emphasize how important individual decision making is in reducing our impact on the environment. I give a series of illustrated talks on the major animal groups, and they differ from other talks, you know, that I hear other people give, because I take my examples from species all over the world. I don't just talk about South African birds or South African frogs or snakes or fishes. Take my examples from all over the world on the basis that our impacts are no longer just local, regional, or continental. Our impacts are global. So potentially, you know, bad decisions that we make wherever we live can impact on animal populations in other continents and on the other side of the world. And there's, you know, everyone makes dozens of decisions every day that are either good or bad for the environment. And what we need to, you know, educate people about is, you know, what are the good decisions? How can one distinguish them from the bad decisions? Because there are just so many things that, you know, individual people can do. And as individuals, as households, as neighborhoods, as people involved with schools and companies and so on, and also in terms of voting for our politicians. So there does need to be a culture shock, if people realizing that this environmental crisis is the worst thing that humankind has ever faced, and we're taking with it many other inhabitants of the planet. And my personal view is that we will shuffle off this mortal coil long before a lot of much more hardy species, such as the coelacanth, which will carry on the experiment of life without humans messing it up. But we've become so arrogant, thinking that our intelligence and our machines makes us independent of nature. But as COVID showed, we are very much subject to nature's checks and balances. And we need to realize that we are the first species to domesticate itself and lose its ecological niche. And that's not a sensible thing to do in nature. So, I think humans need to realize this is a real culture shock. It's a survival shock, and we need to take it extremely seriously.
Adam, a last thought from you?
Sure. We could go on forever. There's so much to talk about. I do, this is a shameless promotion here. I do encourage people to read my book, The End of Eden. I think you will, even if you're an expert on this stuff, you will find stories in there of things that you didn't know. But it's written for non-experts. The whole idea is it's written for people who don't need to have a PhD in anything to access and understand it, because I think what I really try to do is bring home how this actually works and the sort of seriousness of it in a way that's kind of readable but yet very, very grounded in science. Look out. Folks can reach me through my website, adamwelz.net. There's a contact form there if somebody wants to send me an email. I can't always reply immediately, but I do try to get back to everybody. I'd really like to, I'm a little bit on the outside of the conservation world because I don't work for a big organization necessarily and so on, but I really do like networking with people and communicating with people and learning about interesting work that folks are doing, in the conservation world. So, feel free to drop me a line. And it's really been great to do this thing this evening. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Adam. I would also just like to refer back to the point that Prof. Guy made earlier, and that is that nature is really resilient. And that is the hopeful part, that you can conserve nature in your backyard and it can bounce back. So it's not lost. We can do something about this. This is not a statement of loss. I think this is a call to action.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's really the important part. I live on a small little island of Renosterveld in a sea of canola and wheat, and it's just incredible to see over the last, if I say small, I mean 4 or 5 hectares. It is just incredible to see how biodiversity has bounced back over the last 4 or 5 years that I've been privileged to be here. So do take heart, get your hands dirty, and let's do it together. Thank you very much, everybody.